disappear. Have no fear, disappear. Have no fear, disappear.
Thank you for that warm introduction. And let me add my thank yous to those who have been thanking those who are responsible for putting this very spectacular symposium together. Of course, the University of Arizona, the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry, the Africana Studies Department, and most importantly, Professor Alain Philippe Durand for all of his work. Because it takes a visionary, it takes a visionary to transverse all of the bureaucratic and academic obstacles in order to be able to pull something like this together for 2 days, bring scholars from not only the United States, from all over the world. And so I personally am very, very honored to be here as a part of this. I am a hip hop scholar who's really focused on globalization. I teach a course at the University of California, Davis, called Hip Hop in Urban America, so I have to be steeped in hip hop culture here in the United States, but my research is focused on how it is affecting youth all around the world. And so in my presentation today, that I'll mostly focus on my PowerPoint presentation and just talk to you about several points that I'm making about my research. You'll see some of that international trajectory in my presentation, and a focus on the current book, Hip Hop or Hiplife in Ghana. And very soon you'll know what Hiplife is all about. Here's the book. Proud to say it came out September of last year, and I went to Ghana to actually do the book launching there, and it was very successful. I have been going to Ghana for over 35 years, so I have a long history with the country, but this was a culmination, and both the artistic and academic community came out and really supported this particular text that legitimized its hip-hop culture in that country. It started with a 2008 Fulbright Teaching and Research Fellowship at the University of Ghana at Legon. I was a senior lecturer in the Dance Studies Department and conducted my beginning of my field research over a 9-month period. And then in 2010, I did a follow-up interviews with the artists that I discuss in this particular text. The first book, The Africanist Aesthetic in Global Hip Hop, that was published in 2007, and it's always great to hear that it's being used actually functionally in classrooms around the country. I'm always surprised, but I guess I shouldn't be. I hope that that students are really getting some of the convoluted theory that is behind hip hop culture. In our first presentation, we talked about the complexity and the convolutions of hip hop culture, and I always say that we are teaching the hip hop generation now in our classes, and it can be a great hook for students to understand cultural, social, political, and economic theory. And in the right hands, it becomes a great tool for understanding the world. So in my first book, basically I was saying that no matter where hip hop travels in the world, there still has to be an Africanist aesthetic or performance principles and patterns that are a part of it. And I explored and compared England, France, Russia, Japan, and Hawaii, where I lived for 7 years. And one of my main theories that I developed and I still use today is the idea of hip-hop's connective marginalities. Now, most of us think of hip-hop as we look at it internationally and globally, is almost like it has colonized the world. That in fact it has been a kind of another form of American cultural imperialism in terms of how it has filtered out from the United States and taken over the world in a lot of ways. And that we see then the causes for that as being the major purveyors and corporations of hip hop, such as Viacom and EMI and Sony Records, all of those big corporations that are making rap music as a part of hip hop culture a multi-billion-dollar industry globally. However, what I found in my research is that there is another part of that causality, what I call the other bookend to hip-hop's internationalization. And that is this connective marginality. Believe me, there is nothing that the major capitalists could do to spread a new cultural production like hip-hop and have the world take to it like it does if there was not a sense of on-the-ground connection between people. And I talk about connective marginalities as such. I'm saying that what left the United States with rap music was a sense of class, historical oppression, and youth marginality that connected with other youth, and that is another reason on the ground for its pervasiveness and the fact that it is, according to the pundits, has not gone away and in fact is still proliferating. Now, in terms of class marginality, I found in France, Arabs and West Africans having a sense of the second and third generation is still being marginalized and having a sense of second-class citizenship and therefore using rap to talk back to their system. Historical oppression, a good example of that particular connective marginality, Native Hawaiians in Hawaii that have had hundreds of years of oppression, it being their land and having their land usurped. And so in Hawaii, I found that there was, in fact, a sense of rap actually being used by the contemporary sovereignty movement that's going on in that particular state in the United States. Now, youth is a global marginality because youth all over the world are oftentimes marginalized by the adult population, and therefore, as a construct, youth are trying to break into the mainstream or trying to have a voice or trying to become a part of the power structure. So that's the biggest marginality that you find everywhere. And in a country like Japan where it doesn't have necessarily a strong history with Africa or African American culture, youth becomes the major marginality that connects with it. Youth rebellion. But culture, as the fourth marginality, is something that resonates particularly in Africa and in the primary African diaspora of the Caribbean, South America, etc. So that you have this idea that performance principles such as polyrhythm, antiphony, social commentary that we see in rap as having a strong resonance. In Trinidad, they have a form called rapso. As you're going to see, in West Africa, many of the MCs talk about this foundational origins myth. They're saying it didn't start in the Bronx. It started right here where we are, from the griot tradition, and Ghana has another name for it, the Ochiame linguist tradition, so that they hear those same kinds of principles coming back to them that left their shores centuries ago during the Atlantic slave trade. And I'll comment on that a little bit more. So from that sense of the marginality of culture that particularly resonates with Africa and the African diaspora, we have a concept that I talk about in my book called the arc of mutual inspiration. It is a part of a kind of cosmological tenet of temporal circularity. The African diaspora reinvents its African traditions and circulates those musical and dance messages filtered through now our New World voice, which are in turn consumed and reinvented in Africa. And that's what I found in terms of what they call in Ghana the Hiplife. It is part of that Sankofa mythology that has created a sense of mutual inspiration over the centuries of our music, our rhythm, and our cultural retentions. Now, the purpose of the book itself was just to explore hip life music, and that's what they call their hip hop music in Ghana. And it is called hip life because it is a unique synthesis between imported hip hop music and culture from the United States, along with their own pop music called high life. How many of you have heard of high life music? Okay, yeah, it's a popular form of music that became Ghana's pop music in the 20th century, and that filtered throughout West Africa and the world. Where I grew up in the Bay Area, we have several high life bands there that have come and made it their homes. And so as I was being socialized, I was able to go to clubs where high life music was being played right in San Francisco and Oakland, California. So this idea of hip hop and high life coming together has created hip life and what I call an indigenization process. And in fact, that is what hip hop has to go through anywhere in the world if it's going to, in true hip hop cultural tenets, keep it real. Accra, the capital city, was the site of my hip life research. It's about 3 million people. We see here in this particular photograph a strongly commercial street called Oxford Street, named after a street in London, because this is where many of the high-end boutiques, Western boutiques, restaurants, and the ubiquitous cell phone companies in Ghana, where they reside on this particular street. And in this next slide, you see on that street is one of, just to give you a sense of how pervasive hip hop culture is, here is a little food stand, a little chop bar, as they say in Accra, that is called the Tupac Fast Food Bay. Obviously, alluding to the American rapper Tupac Shakur, to lure people in to buy their food right there on the street. Now, when hip hop came to Ghana in the 80s, through various hip hop films that privileged dance, like Beat Street and Breaking 1 and 2, etc., it entered naturally what it does in every single international site, and that is imitation. Once it receives it, the young men usually are trying to imitate Eric B. and Rakim and all the early rappers from New York in English as best they can. And as you can see from this particular photograph of some male youth in the district of Nima in Accra, you see that, again, you have the hip-hop markers, cultural markers of the baggy saggies, baggy t-shirts, but you also see African allusions as well. You see cultural markers of Africa with the young man second from the right in traditional cloth, and two of them doing the usual West African cultural trait of carrying their wares on their head. So you see a kind of blending of cultures right here, even in the imitation phase. Reggie Rockstone, or Reginald Osei, is considered the godfather of Hiplife. He grew up in U.S. and in London, as well as Ghana, going back and forth with his parents. And because he was in the sites of New York and also in Los Angeles, in the Crenshaw district where Ice-T is from, he came back with all the so-called right hip-hop credentials. And we were talking about authenticity earlier, and this alludes right to who is authentic hip-hop when we're looking at this kind of internationalization. When you come back to your global site and you have been in those places, you carry a certain kind of a different kind of street cred, if you will. And so he brought those credentials back when he decided to come back and live in Ghana as an adult. And also what he did was he began to rap in indigenous languages. Before, remember I said in the imitation phase, all they were doing was trying to imitate raps in English. It's part of the indigenization process is to find out how you use your own language to begin to represent your issues and represent your identity through rap music in its new location. Reggie Rockstone became the first to rap in Twi, the language of the Akan, which is the lingua franca of Ghana when they're not speaking English. Now, just a brief diversion so that you understand a little bit more about Hiplife itself as one of the components of this Hiplife movement in Ghana. It actually started at, what one can say, at the beginning of the 20th century. Actually, there are antecedents in the 19th century at the beginning of British control in what was then called the Gold Coast. The Hiplife dance and music bands began really to be formalized around 1910 in Accra, again the capital city, and then it began to spread throughout West Africa from there. It utilized African roots, such as particular kinds of West African rhythms, but with Western music and instrumentation, including horns and guitars. And so it itself was already a kind of blending of the African and the globalized received culture, even at the beginning of the 20th century. And so today, one of the adult critics of Hiplife say that all they're doing is imitating America when they forget that their original pop music of Hiplife was doing the same thing in terms of the British. But E.T. Mensah, in the era of World War II, created a kind of transition in Hiplife that began to create smaller jazz-oriented combos, and they, in doing that, began to utilize more, and here again is that arc of mutual inspiration, Caribbean-style rhythms such as calypso with maracas and bongos as instrumentation along with Western instruments. And that is the Hiplife that we began to see spread throughout West Africa, including Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire. So that Hiplife becomes a merger of hip hop and Hiplife. And it is therefore already a new form of music. It is no longer hip hop. It is Hiplife. And the youth that are in this Hiplife movement see it as such. And they make a distinction between Hiplife and hip hop. And all over Africa now, the continent, it is known as a new genre of music. And this truly becomes the indigenization of hip hop in the sense that they then spawn off new kinds of music that no longer can be called hip hop. So my book is broken down into an introduction in 4 chapters. I want to say a little bit about chapter 1. That's called Making an African Out of the Computer, Globalization and Indigenization in Hiplife. And I'm going to read to you a section that shows you where I get that quote, Making an African Out of the Computer. Chapter 2, Empowering the Young, is all about using cultural studies theory to talk about youth subcultures and the Hiplife youth in Ghana coming out of that kind of tradition of youth subcultures, trying to find their voice in the adult population. The Society of the Spectacle, Hiplife, and Corporate Recolonization is my diatribe on how neoliberal economics is taking over not only our pop culture, but when you see it done in Africa that is just coming out of its colonial period, then the same thing is happening on an economic basis where the country is being recolonized by global capitalism. And then lastly, I talk about The Game, which is a play on a well-known Hiplife track by 2 of the major artists, where they begin to talk about, they understand this issue of how they're being used by capitalism, but in fact, they are forming a kind of counter-hegemonic discourse even within that. Lord Kenya is one of the early rappers that came out a little bit after Reggie Rockstone in the late 90s. And he is the one that came up with that term that says making an African out of the computer. And I'll read to you from the text right here. Lord Kenya reinforces one of the primary concepts of hip hop in relation to Africa, viewing the continent as the actual source of the youth culture. Quote, I'm a true African boy who knows how to make an African out of the computer. I wouldn't say I've been influenced by hip hop because we have structures here in Ghana. To me, what I'm doing is not something I borrowed. I am doing something indigenous. Everybody samples. At the end of the day, I listen to Busta Rhymes, and I know it's indigenous African music. It's just evolution. So these are kinds of comments that many researchers who are doing hip hop research in Africa are finding from contemporary rappers. So in chapter 1, subtitled Globalization and Indigenization in Hiplife, I'm obviously looking at the issues of how does one receive global culture and make meaning out of it with your local needs. And so it was mentioned earlier about the concept of the glocal or glocalization that has been theorized about how those 2 dynamics work. How does a culture receive a foreign new cultural production and at the same time not leave its own roots, and how does it adapt those 2 dynamics for their own needs? And I have a section that I'd like to read from that talks about my theorization about that. Now, glocalization theory has been around for quite a while now, over 10 years, and there have been other theories about what is going on in terms of the adaptation process. But for my purposes, I think glocalization really works very well for what Hiplife is doing. And I talk about Roland Roberts' concept of the glocal that conflates the global influence and local practices. Also what the theorist Pierre Bourdieu calls habitus. It encompasses the story of Hiplife in Ghana. Theories of the relation of the global and the local as polar opposites are not only simplistic, but are only ultimately not useful in deducing the complexity of how groups mediate the inevitable social phenomenon of foreign cultural influences. Global is a concept that captures hip-hop circulation quite succinctly, with youth in discrete locations increasingly comfortable with creating a cultural mashup, if you will, as their collective identity. Hip-hop use in Africa signify the intricacy of the global and local simply and naturally, allowing local practices and received Western influences to connect organically as their own subjectivities. Bourdieu explains habitus as, quote, a subjective but not individual system of internalized structures, schemes of perceptions, conception, and action common to all members of the same group or class, end quote. This schematic of agreed upon cultural conceptions allows a culture or subculture to recognize itself. And it is precisely this recognition of internalized structures that has allowed Hiplife to go through several phases of indigenization on its journey to becoming a society-wide accepted new genre of music in Ghana. One of my examples is a young man by the name of Ochiame Kwame, and if you know anything about Ghanaian culture, the word Ochiame means linguist. It is the traditional linguist who speaks for the chief. He has turned that around in true hip-hop cultural tenets by flipping the script and saying he is the Ochiame now for the people, not for the elite, not for the chief, but for the people. And this is the cover of his second album called Manwensum, or My Poetry. And I wanted to just read a little bit from the text, about him. Ochiame Kwame became a popular solo artist in 2006 with his first album, Boyeba. But in 2008, it was his second album, Manwensum, My Poetry, turned him into an award-winning artist. His hit single, Woso, remixed with the Ghanaian R&B singer Richie, received significant radio airtime, playing in just about every taxi that I took during my 9-month 2008 field trip. Ochiame Kwame's Woso remix was selected for the prestigious Sony Music Africa's One Africa African All-Stars Volume 1 compilation album produced out of South Africa. Today tagged the Rap Doctor, Ochiame Kwame has established his One Mic Entertainment label, an obvious allusion to New York rapper Nas's famous hip-hop track, through which he produced his 2 albums that established his solo career. Now, I wanted to play for you a music video on YouTube of one of his latest tracks called Mr. Versatile. And what it does is it really shows you, you can see, first of all, his image is a kind of player image, right? With the fine suit and the glasses, but he is very, this belies his interest in his own traditional culture, very steeped in his Ashanti culture. He has a MA in Sociology and African Studies from the University of Ghana, which is another point I wanted to make. Contrary to how we see hip hop here as being, quote, ghetto-centristic and coming from the underclass, it is mostly the middle class in Ghana that have become the primary rappers. And maybe in the question and answers, I can go into the causes for that. But I wanted to play for you this music video that truly shows his sense of how he connects not only to his own culture, but to the African diaspora as a part of that concept of the arc of mutual inspiration. Now, hopefully, there's not going to be a, oh, there's an ad, I'm sorry. It's, okay. Ghana flags in the background. Changing from a kind of Western look to a West African dashiki. Wrapping in tree. But the hook is in English. So everybody around the world basically knows what he's talking about. Hip hop to rock, reggae to raga. Raga is the name for their version of reggae in Ghana. All related. Now we go straight back to the traditional in the next verse. That was an appearance, a little cameo by another Hiplife artist by the name of Abodam. Okay, for the second time, I gotta stop it. Sorry. So I think there was, in that particular music video, we saw quite a few of the concepts that I'm talking about in terms of globalization, the arc of mutual inspiration, and the relationship that Hiplife artists in Ghana see with the African diaspora. Another artist is Obor. Or Vice Osei Kufuor is his birth name. He is a very important artist because he is currently the president of the Musicians Union of Ghana, and he is therefore the youngest musician who's ever taken that particular post. And he also is seen as legitimizing Hiplife now in a major way to the older generation in Ghana. He is from the Ashanti region and has an important place to play in the idea of political activism in relationship to youth agency in Hiplife. Like Ochiame Kwame, he uses many of traditional instruments such as the kete drums, and he also has a college degree, and he negotiates both his music and his academic world with aplomb. What particularly distinguishes Obor is his utilization of Hiplife music for various social campaigns that have benefited the country socially, culturally, and politically. Some of his more visible projects have been the promotion of reading and literacy, road and highway safety, which is a big problem in a country with few traffic rules, empowerment of Ghanaian women and girls through education, promoting youth participation in electoral politics, and trees for climate change. And he also started what is called the Ghana First Peace Train that helped the 2008 election and the recent 2012 election to be peaceful, one of the few peaceful elections on the African continent, all coming out of the emphasis of the Hiplife youth artists in that country to promote peacefulness in terms of transition of government. He has become very visible and effective nationally with his local campaigns that the government of Ghana gave him the National Honors Grand Medal. He became the youngest recipient of this national award that was given to him for his contributions to the advancement of the country through his music and social crusades. I had a video of Obor as well, but I don't want to go over my time. How much? Okay, I need to conclude it? Okay. All right. Well, maybe, somewhere else within this conference we'll be able to look at that. Is this where he appears with an older Hiplife artist? Okay, conclusions. Hip-hop's globalization implicitly means a rebellious youth culture challenges the status quo in its new received locality, mapping onto that site the tenet of flipping the script and confronting long-standing social cultural norms of the country's lived experiences. Growing out of the long history of musical exchange in the early 20th century high life music, the Hiplife movement in Ghana implicitly recognizes the cultural resonances, easily imitating, adapting, and finally indigenizing the received pop culture form of hip hop and reworking its meanings and uses for its own needs. And one more conclusion from the book, and this is about youth agency. Agency by youths, projection of their social influence in the public sphere, becomes a way to yield power among themselves and their social context of the older generation in traditional roles of power. All the while, they advocate for their perspectives on the contemporary social issues in which they have a vital stake. Hiplife music and its youth culture have created a new kind of agency for young people in Ghana that they have not previously enjoyed. Hiplife youth in Ghana, like youth cultures or subcultures all over the world, create identity, style, and performative markers that distinguish them from the older generation, which aids the establishment of possibilities of new forms of a public agency. And lastly, I'd just like to say West African youths are creating, in fact, through Hiplife, a counter-hegemonic ideology resulting not only from their style markers, but also from the actual content of their music. Thank you.
To the top, bebop, feel the drop. Too much too late to undo.